This week, the Islamic State militants announced its leadership for Khorasan, a historic region that roughly corresponds to today's Pakistan and Afghanistan. Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, in a message on the internet, declared Hafiz Saeed Khan as the group's leader for the region. This announcement follows months of reports about the emergence of IS, or Islamic States, or Daesh, the Arabic acronym for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We have had reports of fighting between the Taliban and the Islamic State commanders in southern Afghanistan, and we had seen since last summer a number of Pakistani Taliban leaders joining the Islamic State. Dear viewers, I welcome you from RFE's broadcast headquarters in Prague, Czech Republic. My name is Abu Bakr Siddiq, and I edit RFE's Gandhara website that focuses on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Today, we are lucky to have distinguished journalists and experts in this edition of RFE's Live. From Kabul, we are joined by Graham Smith. He is a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group in Afghanistan. In Washington, Sean Carberry is joining us. He is a former NPR correspondent in Afghanistan. And in Prague, Dawood Khattak is joining me. He is the editor of Radio Mashal, RFE's Pashto language service for Pakistan. Today, our primary aim will be to examine the myth and the reality of the Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we will also look at its potential impact on the surrounding region. I will begin with the question, with the news item that we saw a couple days back. The news was about the capture of Abdul Rauf Khadim, the reported leader of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. It was reported by an Afghan news agency that he has been captured by the Afghan Taliban. Now, Sean, what are your sources telling you about this story in Afghanistan?
Well, I think in general, in cases like this, it's very difficult to be clear what's true and what's not. The challenge that's happening now for me when I was still there up until the end of last year and others is that it's harder to see what's happening out in the periphery of the country. You get comments from officials who say something, but you can't necessarily corroborate it through other sources. And there's a lot of propaganda right now around IS, people using it for different reasons. You have local officials who are using it, saying that there's IS in their area as a way to try to get officials in Kabul to send them more resources and security forces. So with anything, I think it takes time right now to really clarify the accuracy of some of these claims and what it really means. So at this point, I'm not entirely certain, how accurate some of these claims are. I think maybe, Graham, you're still closer to the action than I am. I don't know if you have more clarity or confidence in reports like this.
Graham, I would like you to comment on his reported capture, but also being on ground in Afghanistan. Give us an idea of your assessment of how significant is the emergence of IS in Afghanistan.
Well, the short answer is that the emergence of IS in Afghanistan is not very significant so far, but it's worrying. I mean, it could potentially be significant in the future. I think that's why people are paying attention to it, not so much because it has military significance right now, but because politically what it reveals about some of the internal fissures within the Afghan Taliban movement. Just to answer your question briefly about the capture of Mullah Rauf, we don't know for sure whether he's been captured or not. It makes sense, though, if he was running into some trouble, because in the days before his capture, my colleague in Kandahar was hearing that people in Sangin, people in Kajaki were a little bit angry with these newcomers, with these self-declared Daesh supporters, because they were going around and desecrating graveyards, which is more of a Pashtun tradition than a Wahhabist tradition. And they were also forbidding people from attending condolence ceremonies. Again, more of a Pashtun tradition than a Wahhabist tradition. And so these instances of cultural clash between the newcomers from Daesh and the many thousands of years of Pashtun culture in that area mean that it may be a little bit difficult for Daesh to take root as a movement if they're going to insist on these strict forms of Wahhabism.
Graham, I mean, you mentioned, it's very interesting, the clash between Afghan cultural values and the radical worldview that Daesh or the Islamic State is apparently trying to bring to Afghanistan or any region that it wants to control or it's controlling in Iraq and Syria, of course. So, I mean, do you see that there is, given that now the NATO forces have ended their combat mission in the country, do you see any opportunities for Daesh to make a big comeback, to emerge in Afghanistan or potentially make an impact?
Well, yeah, I mean, despite this fact, as you say, that it's sort of an uphill battle for Daesh culturally, there are opportunities for more extreme groups like Daesh, or like Mahazi Fedayeen or Jundullah or any of these other groups that are sort of offshoots from the Taliban. And the reason for this is, I think, that we're reaching, as you mentioned, a critical moment politically as the foreign troops withdraw, and some Taliban leaders and even rank-and-file Taliban are apparently asking each other, where is our leader? Where is our, Mullah Omar, what's he doing? And particularly, what is his response to this new political change inside Afghanistan? And what is his response to the declaration from a rival caliph? Having the emergence of someone who declares himself to be the leader of the faithful in Iraq and Syria poses a kind of ideological challenge to the Taliban movement, and so far there has been fairly limited response from the Taliban leadership on this. And so I think, in that sort of leadership vacuum, you see the opportunity for some of these splinter groups to emerge, and frankly, the same old tribal rivalries that we've seen for many, many years within the Taliban being exacerbated.
Now, turning to Pakistan, I want to ask Dawood about the announcement of this so-called Khorasan Shura. Who are these people, and how significant are they in the militant landscape in Pakistan and Afghanistan, particularly in Pakistan's tribal areas?
Thank you, Abu. It all started in the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, soon after the killing of Hakim-ullah Masood and the group.
Which was in 2013.
In November 2013, I think. And the group which was once considered the strongest one in Pakistan areas, it started shattering, and mainly because of the leadership crisis. When Mullah Fazlullah, a non-Masood tribesman, was appointed as the chief of their group. So there were internal rivalries between the different Taliban groups in the Masood areas, Waziristan region. And many Taliban leaders were simply feeling alienated because non-Masood was brought forward as the leader of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan.
And Masood being this large Pashtun tribe that lives primarily in South Waziristan tribal agency, and a lot of the TTP leaders and foot soldiers were Masood in the beginning.
Yeah, and secondly, Mullah Fazlullah, who was from Swat region, which is a non-tribal area, and he is most of the time living somewhere in the border side or across the border, as reported in Kunar or Nuristan province of Afghanistan. So but the Taliban leader, which already have their differences, and alongside their monetary sources were also shrinking following this leadership crisis in the region, and they were feeling themselves like a weakened group because and finally when the Pakistan military started operation in South Waziristan tribal agency, so it was also sort of a crushing blow to the Taliban. So they were because of the leadership differences, because of the tribal rivalries, and because of the financial resources shrinking, I think at the moment a kind of thinking was developing in the ranks of Taliban leadership who were disgruntled or who were aggrieved, like the commander Shahidullah Shahid. He was the second person who announced separation from the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. Before him, it was Umar Khalid Khorasani, whose real name is Abdul Wali, and he was one time the commander of Pakistan Muhammad tribal district. He announced his own group in the name of Jamaat Ahrar. Shahidullah Shahid was the second person who joined this ISIS. And initially there were only 5 commanders with him, but finally when he was announcing the leadership of Hafiz Saeed Khan, who was announced as the ISIS leader, he was also among the aggrieved leaders of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan because he was not agreed with the appointment of Mullah Umar as the chief of TTP. So they came together and they also announced some names from the Afghanistan side, like this Mullah Rauf and also Muslim Dost and some Al-Emarati, Saad Emarati for Logar province. So I think obviously it's mainly because of the leadership crisis inside the TTP and the shrinking of resources and their tribal rivalry. Now they are moving to form a new group.
And you have mentioned that they are keen. Some of the TTP leaders are keen on joining this new group. Do you have any idea to just share with our viewers how big a threat potentially they are, and how many people, how many militants or militant factions we are actually thinking about when we mention the Islamic State in Pakistan?
Well, as Graham mentioned earlier, there is not very much significance on the Afghan side. So I would say the same thing about the Pakistani side right now. But it's a matter of time. There are a few factors that I can say that this group right now is not going to be a big threat. One is that if the Taliban flourished, or some of the militant group flourished in Pakistan since 2001, it was partly because of the Pakistani establishment policies and also partly because of the Taliban were quite a new phenomenon. But since the Peshawar school attack, when I see the whole situation, the public opinion is very much against the Taliban. Secondly, about the like the local support, the only thing which can help with the ISIS group and they can flourish with the passage of time, that is the channelizing of money. Right now the TTP monetary sources are it's like shrinking, and majority of the Taliban leaders who are neither on the TTP side nor on the ISIS side, like the recently announced ISIS side. So they are looking at the situation that which way they are going. Particularly if you look at the Masood Taliban, Khan Said Sajna, who has his own group and he refused to follow the leadership of Mullah Fazlullah. Recently, Sharia group also they achieved some sort of agreement with Khan Said Sajna, and they are silent right now, partly because of this ongoing operations that by us in Pakistan, Waziristan tribal district, and partly because of they are watching the situation. So many Taliban leaders who are so far not joining this group, they are looking at the situation. But once if the ISIS really started getting some monetary resources from abroad or from whichever side. So I think that just like whatever the Al-Qaeda people did during the 2001, they distributed a lot of money and they used the religion. So I think they can do the same. But the problem is again the same, that Wahhabi traditions and Salafi tradition, these are in like in contrast and in clash with the Pashtun tradition in the region, and the people are almost, I can say that they are fed up with the Taliban violence over the past few years. So right now, I don't see much chances for them but it's a matter of time that how they can survive, at least for the coming year or so.
Moving on to Washington, Dawood, thanks for bringing, your overview of a very complex issue, a very complex region which is not accessible to journalists mostly and researchers, particularly foreign media. Sean, you have spent more than 2 years in Afghanistan, and you've covered very difficult stories. I want to ask you something particularly about covering these kind of stories, because we have seen since 9/11 that, the media typically puts out a lot of the propaganda stuff that these extremists put out. There is a lot of confusing reporting, and of course, access is a main issue. Now, if this story becomes balloons into something bigger in Afghanistan and Pakistan, how do you think, what should we watch for, and how you think it should be reported?
Well, yes, as you say, access is getting more difficult, and it was getting more difficult in the time that I was there. And a lot of what's happening is happening in remote areas where foreign journalists aren't there, and even a lot of Afghan journalists are having trouble getting clear access to these places. So you hear a statement from either a local official or from one of these militant groups, and you do have to essentially report this is what they're saying, but you have to be clear about what you can verify and what this means, and make sure that you're not simply parroting what some of these people are saying and confirming that. I think it will get more difficult and challenging, because also there were fewer journalists there now than there were 2 years ago. I think, one of the things, again, that's always a challenge is pushing the sources, especially local Afghan officials. I've run into this many times, where you speak to a district police chief over the phone who is saying there's an attack happening, there are dozens of Taliban overrunning our district center. You talk to other officials there, and they'll say the same thing. You would talk then to someone at NATO, and they say, you know what, we actually flew a drone over that area, and we didn't see anything. We did not see this activity on the ground that local officials said was happening. And again, in that case, it's often local officials trying to use hot button items, like saying there's IS in our area, you need to give us more troops, weapons, money, support, whatever it is. So everyone's going to have to be careful about how this is being used for people's personal interests. I do want to come back to a couple of things that have been said previously that I think are important context. One is that what might be the most disconcerting element of people declaring allegiance to IS in Afghanistan and Pakistan is the sign that these groups, the Taliban there, are fragmenting further, and that there are internal schisms, leadership disagreements. And what that means is you have now more subgroups who are acting on their own, and if peace talks do begin, the question is how many members of the Taliban are under the same umbrella and under the leadership that will come to the table, and if there is a peace deal, how many people can you take off the battlefield? If you have more splinter groups, they're acting on their own, they're not listening to the leadership that they once did. So that's something that's of concern to watch, is how much splintering there is. The other question that still really isn't clear yet, the Taliban in Afghanistan have always been a domestic movement. They are not like Al-Qaeda or some other groups that have international aspirations. They've always wanted to control Afghanistan. They haven't been interested in invading neighboring countries or establishing a caliphate. So these people who have left the Taliban are now claiming that they're allied with IS. Are they now changing their attitude? Do they want to be part of something international and join something that is a threat to other countries and the international community, or are these still people who only care about Afghanistan but are waving this flag to get attention, to express their grievances with former commanders that they worked with. And again, these are questions that are going to be very difficult to answer without being able to be on the ground and access these people and clearly understand motivations and their actions.
Thanks. Let's go to Kabul and ask Graham. I mean, Graham, of course, you have to tell us about how united the Taliban are in Afghanistan. They are perhaps one of the few movements in recent Afghan history that has kind of successfully fought off this pressure of fragmenting into warring factions. And of course, what capacity do you think that the Afghan forces are capable of fighting off these threats? In recent weeks, we have had reports from fighting in the emergence of IS in particular in Helmand and fighting between Taliban and the Islamic State in Helmand. There were reports about the presence of foreign fighters in Zabul province and the emergence of IS in Farah province, which is a western province. So tell us about all these issues.
Yeah, it's interesting that you, at the beginning of your question, mentioned that the Taliban remain relatively cohesive. Because you're right, despite all these various splinter groups, despite all the various factions within the Rakhbari Shura, the Taliban, compared to other armed groups historically, and even modern-day political parties in Afghanistan, has been relatively cohesive. The actions of the Taliban on during the second round of the elections, I think, clearly illustrate that, because there was a very cohesive political strategy by the insurgency to reduce violence on the second round of the elections in what they call Loy Kandahar, Greater Kandahar area in the south, and Loy Paktia in the southeast. You could see actually the exact borders of Taliban influence in the east, where it was completely different. The east was on fire on election day. But in those areas that are largely controlled by the Afghan Taliban, what is sometimes called the Quetta Shura, the Rakhbari Shura, there does seem to be some degree of political cohesion. But like Sean said, I mean, the emergence of these new groups tends to undermine that, and tends to, really question our ability to make peace if the command and control simply isn't there. And really, I mean, what you have to do is just monitor all of these small groups. So, for example, we're watching a group of about 400 Daesh who are operating between Baramcha and Girdi Jungle down in southern Helmand and on the border of Pakistan. For the moment, they seem to be gaining a bit of momentum after having joined Daesh. Mullah Habibullah, who runs the small madrasa down there, he seems to have obtained more money and weapons. It's a little bit unclear at the moment whether the momentum that he's gained is as a result of having good branding, or is it a result of actual support from the Gulf? So we don't know yet sort of whether the flow of fighters and weapons is actually indicating any kind of operational link with Daesh proper. But it's just simply something we have to monitor in the coming weeks and months.
And what is your assessment of the Afghan army or Afghan security forces' capacity to counter such threats?
Well, so far, since as the NATO troops have been withdrawn, we went from about 140,000 international forces at the very peak in 2011, and now we are down to something like 12 or 13,000 international forces today. That process has been accompanied by, across the country, a general erosion of government control in outlying districts, rising violence. And so we've reached this unfortunate place now where We're expecting a new report from the United Nations very soon about protection of civilians that will probably show that more women and children and other civilians are dying with every passing month here. The casualties amongst the security forces are up quite significantly. The numbers are disputed, but my understanding is if you combine deaths and injuries, that ANSF casualties have roughly doubled in 2014 as compared to 2013. And that is quite a serious problem. If you talk to any police commander or military commander in the ANSF, they'll tell you, look, my guys are dying. This is a real problem. Now, to their credit, they're keeping up their pace of operations. If you look at the number of offensive operations by ANSF over the course of the last 2 years or so, it's held steady month by month. And so, by the numbers at least, what that suggests to us analysts is that although the Afghan forces are suffering a really heavy toll at the moment, and a rising toll, so far they're showing a lot of courage and still managing to conduct their operations. So the real question is whether or not the ANSF would reach a breaking point, and so we simply don't know.
Now, Sean, I mean, you've been in Washington for some time now, and I'm sure you're in contact with some of the officials and think tankers and experts who watch Afghanistan and Pakistan. How worried is Washington about the emergence of the Islamic State in these two countries? And do you think, I mean, it's a related question, that Afghanistan is now, I mean, Washington is sick of Afghanistan, and it's a more or less a forgotten story in Western capitals, including Washington?
Well, the level of worry is, I would say, low to maybe moderate here in Washington. It's viewed as we've been discussing so far, as something that it's an emerging phenomenon. It's not clear to what extent these people are really serious ideological members of Daesh or IS at this point, or whether again they're looking for attention. I think a lot of policymakers here have larger concerns about the overall fight in Afghanistan, about this ongoing training mission, making sure that that's working, accomplishing its goals. So it's something that people are watching. It's something that could emerge into something bigger, but it's certainly not reaching crisis levels here. As I say, there are enough other problems and concerns in Afghanistan that are more present than that. To the second question about sort of the Afghanistan fatigue, I mean, that's really something that's been going on for years. I mean, I first got to Kabul in the summer of 2012, and I could feel then that interest in the U.S. was really decreasing at that point. People were simply getting tired of hearing daily reports about the violence, about U.S. troops getting killed, about Afghan civilians being killed, and it's hard to sustain the American interest over 13, 14 years when there is a sort of a constant drumbeat of death and bad news. And obviously people will complain that the media aren't reporting the positive things happening, which is always one of those debates that yes, we do report a lot of the positive things, but they do get overshadowed by the fact that after 13 years, the economy is actually on a downward trend right now. Security has been on a downward trend. Civilian casualties on an upward trend. Afghan forces, as Graham was saying, dying and being injured in record numbers. The opium harvest in 2014 set a new record, so the illicit economy is growing. So there are a lot of negative factors there, and that also certainly wears on a lot of people, and people here have this feeling, look, this country is a chronic problem, and these things aren't being solved. A lot of Americans, frankly, are tired of American money and lives being spent there, and that's the challenge of policymakers and advocates, is to try to present an argument to say there needs to be continued engagement, and here's what can be accomplished. And that's a tough dynamic right now, and so a lot of people would like this story to go away, and given what's happening in Iraq and Syria, they're much more focused on that.
Well, one story that's unlikely to go away is the story in Pakistan because of its nuclear weapons, because of its strategic location, and simply because of being one of the major Muslim countries in the world with a population of nearly 190 million. Let me ask Dawood. I mean, we have seen kind of contradictory statements in the past few months from Pakistani officials about the emergence of the IS. And recently there was a report of some Islamic State facilitator or recruiter being arrested in Lahore. And of course, the rest of this leadership of IS, the Khorasan, as they call it, the Khorasan leadership is based in tribal areas. How do you see Islamabad dealing with this emerging threat, given that it claims to have changed its course after last month's attack on a military-run school in Peshawar, which saw more than 150 students and teachers killed?
Well, Abu, I will come to your question, but let me step out of my area, and first I have to drop a very brief comments what Sean and Graham said about the, as you asked about the gaining strength by the ISIS in Afghanistan. I guess that the reconciliation process, whatever is going on with the Taliban by the Afghan government, I think some of the Taliban leadership on the Afghan side, they are obviously they are not happy with the reconciliation, and if this is going on, so I think they can switch over some sides and they can go to the ISIS side. Coming to Pakistan, recently the Pakistan Interior Ministry said that they don't see any threat from the ISIS here on the Pakistani side, and they even don't see any presence of the ISIS in Pakistan. But before that, we are getting a report in Pakistan southwestern Balochistan province by the Home Department. The province is joining both Afghanistan and Iran, and the Home Department reported that there is presence of ISIS in that area, though this report was not followed by media, and also further information was not provided by the Balochistan government. Now, very fresh reports are coming, as you mentioned, from Pakistan, eastern city of Lahore, which is also called the heart of Pakistan. And there they say that Yusuf al-Salafi, a person in the name of Yusuf al-Salafi, he was arrested and he came to Pakistan 6 months ago, and he was paying like $600 per person for recruiting and sending people to Syria. And he had his local accomplice in the name of Hafiz Tayyib. He is also under investigation. Well, whatever we are getting about these two cases, rather this one case, and there is no further information, and whatever is reported is that through intelligence sources, and they say that they are under investigation. Well, if even this is true, so it shows that some presence is here. As for the Pakistan policies, so I think the Pakistani side, the Haqqanis or the Afghan Taliban, they are on one side, but the Pakistani military or the Pakistani governments, they never tolerated the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or the Al-Qaeda, because they chased them, they arrested them, and they handed them over, means Al-Qaeda, to the United States over the past 10 to 12 years. So, and whatever ISIS is doing are some of the other militant groups like IMU. I think there is a zero tolerance on the Pakistani security side. Some groups like, as they recently mentioned, and it is always reported that there is no distinction between, Pakistan is no more doing any distinction between the Taliban. This is always given in reference to the Haqqani network, and everyone knows very well that why they are saying so are the Quetta Shura, Afghan Taliban Quetta Shura, but so far the TTP is concerned, so far the ISIS is concerned, or so far the other splinter groups like Jamaat al-Ahrar is concerned, I think there is no tolerance. And this Operation Zarb-e-Az, very recently, 2-3 days ago, the Pakistani military released a statement of air bombing in North Waziristan, and their statement mentioned that some of the people who were killed in that bombing, some Daesh people or ISIS people, rather majority of the ISIS people were including in them. So Pakistan, obviously, it is and it must take it seriously, looking at the, as you mentioned, the Peshawar school attack. So the threat level, obviously, it must be and it is very high about the ISIS, and they are not going to have any kind of toleration for this.
And what is your assessment of, we know that IS or Islamic State is a very rich group. It controls oil wells and has inherited a lot of wealth and a lot of weaponry in the areas in Iraq and Syria that it has captured. It attracts a lot of recruits from Europe in particular, from among the Muslim diaspora, but from across the world really. In your assessment, can it also attract Pakistan's largest Salafi jihadi organization, which is now called Jamaat Dawa? Formerly it was called Lashkar-e-Taiba.
You mean Salafi jihadis to the fold of ISIS?
Yes, yes.
I don't think so, because the agenda of Jamaat Dawa is something different. They are mostly focused on India, or to be more specific, on the Indian Kashmir, I think. And most of the time it is considered as a pro-Pakistan government and pro-Pakistan military group, because we see that Jamaat Dawa chief, despite he is under ban from the United Nations and from the United States, I mean international ban on him, he is observing like protest gatherings, and he is holding public meetings. Recently in Karachi they launched a special ambulance service, so despite this ban issue. So I don't think that Jamaat Dawa is, it will be, despite this monetary consideration, I don't think that they will be going to the side.
And ideological ISIS considerations as well.
Obviously, I think ideologically, Jamaat Dawa people and ISIS people, they are a little bit closer to each other, I think.
Yes.
Because they are already, they are not the Bandis, and the ISIS people are Salafis, and the Jamaat Dawa people are more inclined to that side. So I think it is, but as for the, because Jamaat Dawa is having its offices in all the Pakistani cities, they are not in the mountains, or they are not in the uninhabited areas. They are sitting in the cities.
But do you think that it's something that's tolerated by Islamabad?
Obviously, whatever we are seeing, like Hafiz Muhammad Saeed, he is holding these meetings in Islamabad. Sometimes he is forming a organization like the DPC or Defy Pakistan Council, if you see 2012, the situation in 2012. And then some religious leaders are also joining him, like Jamaat Islami, like Maulana Samiul Haq, like Fazlur Rahman, Jamiat Ulama Islam, and like Hamid Gul, former military people. So they are joining hands. So obviously there is a toleration on the Pakistani side for Jamaat Dawa.
And now in Kabul, Graham, we recently heard President Karzai, and he had a kind of a very interesting perspective on the emergence of the IS. He told an international journalist that in his views, IS is not an indigenous thing. It's a continuation of the same phenomena of foreign interference in Afghanistan, of some of Afghanistan's neighbors sending militants to further their interest or protect their interest in Afghanistan. Obviously, he refused to name a country, but most Afghans think that he meant Pakistan, and he was essentially saying that the black flags of the IS is a new effort to torpedo these efforts to make peace with the Taliban, as Dawood mentioned, the whole issue of reconciliation with the Taliban. How do you see it in Kabul?
Well, for years and years, I think, especially when he was in power, President Karzai had a habit of overstating the foreign role in the insurgency in Afghanistan. He sometimes actually refused to use the word insurgency because he saw this as purely terrorism coming from Pakistan and from other neighboring countries. But the fact is that the vast majority of the people who are out there in the fields frankly not far from where I'm sitting, who are fighting the state of Afghanistan are Afghans. Now, that being said, I think President Karzai has a very good point that with the emergence of Daesh, especially in the southern parts of Afghanistan, that does appear to be a genuinely foreign movement. I think particularly in the sectarian nature of some of the Daesh ideology. Dawood made a very good point about these guys having quite a different point of view than some of the Afghan Taliban. And you can see that playing out actually on the ground. I mean, in Quetta, I think there are active debates amongst Taliban about, for example, their approach to Shia. You saw just very recently another large attack in Sindh province against Shia targets. I think it was 40 killed, 50 injured, something like that. That kind of massive sectarian violence is simply not a part of the war in Afghanistan right now. There are Shia neighborhoods in downtown Kandahar city. There are obviously large Shia neighborhoods here in Kabul. There have been sporadic incidents of sectarian violence, but nothing particularly serious so far, which is very fortunate, actually. And so if we do start to see, for example, the Shia Hazara population being targeted more disproportionately, then you might start to see that, this foreign money, frankly, a lot of it from private donors in the Gulf, is starting to change the ideological character of the insurgency in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Sean, we have a question from one of our viewers on Twitter. And the question is, will IS in Afghanistan have an effect on the economy? How about the opium trade?
Tough to immediately answer either of those questions. I mean, the opium trade, it's entirely possible that they are going to be involved in that. It's possible that some of these people have been involved in it already. I mean, the Taliban have used opium as one of their sources of funding for quite a while, so that's something that really crosses almost every sector in Afghanistan. I mean, you have obviously police and government officials who are involved in the opium trade, as well as various militant and criminal groups. And that, again, is one of the other longer-term questions and concerns about Afghanistan. Even if some of these militant groups, if the Taliban can be brought to the table for peace negotiations, you still have this growing narco state dynamic there, where you have criminal actors who are concerned with making sure that the trade goes on, that there's trafficking. So some of the South American style drug states activities there, and that's going to be a long-term concern, and it's very unclear at this point how Afghanistan and the international community is going to prevent the drug trade from continuing to spread in the country and assorted criminal activity. In terms of the economy as a whole, I think this IS phenomenon is distinct from that, but it's related in that as long as the economy is weak and there's unemployment and a lot of young Afghans don't have any hope of a job and a stable living, then these militant groups are going to be an appeal. It gives them, in some cases, a salary. It gives them a sense of purpose. And so that's one of these connections that's essential in Afghanistan, is building an economy that becomes something that attracts people, pulls them away from militancy or other things when they feel that they have no hope. So it's as I say, I don't think IS in Afghanistan directly will have an impact on the economy itself, but a weak economy is something that allows IS and other militant groups to continue to proliferate there.
And one area that we haven't discussed so far is this apparent rivalry between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. In Iraq and Syria, we saw, particularly in Syria, that the Islamic State is fighting against an Al-Qaeda-linked group called Jabhat al-Nusra. So, Graham, what is your assessment of the rivalry between the IS and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, given that Al Qaeda was emerged in the border region between the two countries, although most of its members and leaders were not Afghans or Pakistani?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that for a really long time now in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda has been a significantly diminished force. I mean, I spent years living in southern Afghanistan and researching down there, and we ran into Arabs just very occasionally. You know, one of my researchers ran into a bunch of Arabs in Zabul province. Sometimes the military interpreters would hear Arabic spoken on the radio chatter that they were intercepting. But it was really a marginal presence. You're starting to see a few more reports recently, especially as the large Pakistani military operations in the tribal areas are starting to push some Arab and Uzbek families into Afghanistan. As I said earlier, you know, the Afghan government's ability to control its own territory is diminishing. So there's a somewhat, you know, greater opportunity for some of these international jihadists to hide out in remote areas. But yeah, I think you're right that essentially there are rival extremist groups here, and I think they are competing for the same funding, essentially, from wealthy people in the Gulf who want to support jihad. And that funding at the moment appears to be shifting towards IS, towards Daesh. And it's not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, remember. I mean, there are these sort of franchises, if you will, of Daesh now emerging in the Sinai, in Egypt, in eastern Libya. Some of my colleagues are researching out there. And so in many different places around the world, Daesh does seem to be at least attracting more funding than some of these other groups.
Now, following up on this, Dawood, let me ask you one last question. How threatened, I mean, we have discussed Afghanistan in detail, but Pakistan's other neighbors and Afghanistan's neighbors, Iran in particular, China, Central Asia, and India, I mean, do they feel threatened by IS in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, obviously, if you see recently, like some reports suggested that Chinese official, after some attacks the past year in China's Xinjiang province, they registered, through sources we came to know that, and through media reports we came to know that they registered their reservations about the presence of IMU in the Pakistani tribal areas, and it is also said that this operation in North Waziristan was one of the reasons for launching this operation was a pressure from the Chinese side. So obviously they are concerned about what is going on in this region. As for Iran, Iran will be the most concerned country, I think, as the emergence of ISIS in this region is concerned, because all the Tehrik-e-Taliban leaders who are joining this new group, they are, most of them are anti-Shias, although there is another group in Pakistan in the name of Lashkar-e-Jhangi, which is specifically targeting Pakistani Shias. But this ISIS people were also don't have a soft corner for the Shia minority Muslims in Pakistan. And then the recent reports of ISIS presence in Balochistan province, and then the exchange of firing on the Pakistan-Iran border, I think it's all suggests that this is a kind of concern on the Iranian side. And as for as you see on the Afghan side, I think Helmand, Farah, and Nimroz provinces, the presence of ISIS people in those areas, obviously these are close to the Iranian border, so this is also a cause of concern. And like my assessment is that if this situation continue, once again we can say that this can go to a sort of regional rivalries, which can include countries as far away as Saudi Arabia and even India.
Thank you. Sean, what, in your view, should we focus on to watch in near future?
I think really the immediate focus is whether or not the cabinet is going to be approved anytime soon. I mean, this is the big immediate challenge for Afghanistan, is getting this new government finalized, getting cabinet ministers in place and starting to look at what their policies are going to be. And the longer this takes, the more it undermines confidence in the new government and raises concerns about how effective this new national unity government with the president and CEO are going to be at governing this country and solving some of these problems. So that's really the first order is, are they going to get this cabinet settled, and then what's it going to look like, and how are they going to move forward governing?
Graham, the last word. Do you see IS in 1 year or the next few years emerging, replacing the Taliban in Afghanistan?
Well, you know, actually, I had to recently decide what I was going to choose as my next research topic in Afghanistan. As you know, with the International Crisis Group, I do very long, detailed research papers. And one of the options was to do a really hard, detailed look at the emergence of Daesh, the emergence of IS in Afghanistan. And what we decided is it's actually not important enough yet. It's still a very small phenomenon. And so after I finish my most recent project, I'm going to work next on the economy. Because I think the free fall of the Afghan GDP, the fiscal crisis of the government, and the massive unemployment situation may actually end up being more critical than what we're seeing so far with Daesh.
Gentlemen, thanks for participating in this RFE RL Live today. Thank you very much.
Welcome.